Let me get going here. So again, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And so this presentation kind of goes back and forth in different scales. So we start off talking about legislation, then we're going to talk about Sarasota Bay because that's where I came from. The last 5 years, I was a director there. Then I'm going to try to expand it like across the country and then compare some of the things we're seeing in Florida to other locations. So let's make sure that this works out. So you guys got the next slide? Perfect.
Yep.
All right. So we're going to talk about enabling federal and state legislation, bridging the gap between science and management. I'm going to focus strongly on the Sarasota Bay, but not exclusively, about how we went from this understanding about the problems are to communicating with the stakeholders and the public to actually get something done. And we got a lot done in a very short period of time. And then a couple of examples of ecosystem scale restoration. So it's going to be bouncing around at different levels. All right, so the federal government has been involved with water quality and pollution control since Truman was president. Back in 1948, we had the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, and then the Clean Water Act, which was signed into law by Richard Nixon. And then it was revised under Carter, and then further revised via the Water Quality Act 1987 under Ronald Reagan. So, it's always been bipartisan support for water quality at the federal government level. We had two Republicans, two Democrat presidents who signed, different versions of what we're supposed to do to deal with water quality. Section 320 is the part of the Water Quality Act that created the National Estuary Programs. You guys over there are within the boundaries of the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program. I was the director of the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. There are four of them in Florida. The old one that was called Coastal and Heartland, it's now called Coastal and Heartland, it used to be called Charlotte Harbor. And then, of course, Tampa Bay. Sarasota Bay is the oldest one of those four. All right. The state of Florida has also been involved in water quality issues for about 40 years at least. And so the first entryway, if you would, for the state to get involved in this was in the SWIM Act, the Surface Water Improvement and Management Act of 1987. And what it did is it gave guidance to all the water management districts in Florida, so South Florida, Southwest Florida, St. Johns, Suwannee, Northwest Florida. And it said you need to come up with a list of priority water bodies and you need to come up with pollutant load reduction goals. So a pollutant load reduction goal would be basically, it's a modeling exercise, different ways you can approach it. But for example, it would say, hey, my system can't handle more than 100 tons of nitrogen per year. Otherwise, I have all these problems. And I'm now getting 120. So my pollutant load reduction goal is 20 tons per year. It's pretty straightforward, but it had no regulatory hook to it. You weren't required to do anything other than develop it. So about 12 years later, Florida came up with the Watershed Protection Act, 1999, and it basically gave this regulatory hook. And it said, you have to monitor water quality. Florida has this devolved responsibility for managing the state's waters, but they are overseen by EPA. And if EPA thinks that Florida's not doing enough, then they have the capacity, maybe not lately, but they have the capacity to kind of take some of that, claw some of that back. So you have to monitor water quality. It's not like a matter of like, oh, I think it'd be interesting to monitor water quality. You have to. Someone has to monitor it. If you don't do it, then the state's going to do it for you. You then compare your water quality against those standards. Where did the standards come from? Well, it depends. We developed our own in Sarasota Bay. I've developed them in consulting for Collier County. Some places just defer to the state of Florida. Whatever you tell me I need to do, I'll do it. Or you can just take control of it yourself, which is, I think, the preferred approach. You compare your water quality against those standards, and then you determine if you're impaired or not. And impaired doesn't mean I missed my water quality standard 1 month. It doesn't even mean 1 year. Impairment is determined on an annual basis, but you're not impaired unless you exceed your criteria more than once in 3 years. So if I pass, fail, pass my criteria, I've passed my criteria. If I fail, pass, fail, I've failed my criteria. So it takes 3 years for water quality to be determined to be out of compliance with your established nutrient criteria. If that's the case, then you develop a TMDL, which is a total maximum daily load. It's the same thing as a pollutant load reduction goal, but it has regulatory teeth. And what a total maximum daily load does is it says the same thing. Hey, you know what? My system's going to be healthy if I have less than 100 tons of nitrogen, but I got 120. So my load reduction goal is 20. But how it kind of follows up on that is the difference between that and then the 1987 Act, which says you now have to have a basin management action plan where it basically says, all right, you got to get rid of 20 tons. Who's going to do what? So it basically would say, hey, Martin County, you have to do this. St. Lucie County, you have to do that. Anyone who's got a permit has to come up with projects. And the BMAP is supposed to be self-implementing through what we call the NPDES permit. So if you have a wastewater treatment plant, you have to have a permit. If the load reduction says wastewater needs to reduce by 40%, then you need to do that. If you are someone who controls a regional stormwater collection, treatment, and distribution system, that's called like an MS4 system, then you have to do something. So BMAPs are meant to be self-implementing. So it sounds like a really well thought process, and it is. But as we'll see, it's not really giving us what we thought we were going to get, or we're lagging behind the expectations, frankly. So the particular concerns referenced in those U.S. and state laws that I'm going to talk about for the next, 40 minutes or so are seagrass losses because, hey, you're on the east coast of Florida. You understand the importance of seagrass losses on the east coast of Florida, but also toxins. Toxins are a big problem more and in the more industrialized portions of the United States. But like we had really, for a while, we had the highest lead level concentration in the United States in a portion of Sarasota Bay. We don't know exactly where it came from, but we think it might have come from um, a place where the newspaper used to like wash their, they're called linotype machines, sort of the things used for printing newspapers. And we got a lot of lead-based contamination there. But also low oxygen. Hypoxia means oxygen levels so low that fish, crabs, shrimp, clams can't live. And that's a real problem in a lot of areas. So let's get going. Examples of ecosystem scale restoration, because this is my favorite topic. I mean, I love to talk about this because there are a lot of them and they're really big and it should give us a sense of optimism, realistic optimism. So we're going to talk about Chesapeake Bay, which is the model for the National Estuary Program. Sarasota Bay, because it's the one I'm just, the most familiar with the last 5 years. And then broader Southwest Florida, Galveston Bay, Narragansett Bay, Long Island Sound, and we're going to end up with New York, New Jersey Harbor because they're really cool stories in all these systems. So Chesapeake Bay. Cool thing about Chesapeake Bay is it's huge. It's 10 times bigger than the biggest estuary we have in Florida. The biggest estuary we have in Florida is Tampa Bay, pretty similar size to Biscayne Bay. Chesapeake Bay is more than 10 times bigger. It actually has a watershed that encompasses 5 states and 20 million people. And the neat thing about it is the water body is huge. The watershed is almost exactly the same size as the state of Florida. So if you compare Chesapeake Bay watershed, state of Florida, they differ by 3%. So what we have on the right-hand side is a summary of recent water quality data across a watershed that is as large as the state of Florida, basically. And if there's a downward-facing triangle, that means there's a statistically significant decrease in nitrogen in the tributaries and the open waters of Chesapeake Bay. And this is phenomenal news. The largest estuary in the United States has a lot more green facing, downward facing triangles than anything else. More than 90, I think it's more than 95% of the locations have a reduction in nitrogen. Now, why are we worried about nitrogen? If you want your lawn to look green, and if you want your citrus tree to grow faster, add nitrogen. Well, if you want your bay to look green and you want algae to grow faster, add nitrogen. But we don't want that. So it's really water quality management kind of focuses on nutrient management. In Biscayne Bay, it would be phosphorus. Most of our coastal systems, including the Indian River Lagoon, it's going to be nitrogen. So look at that beautiful trend. The Chesapeake Bay is getting cleaner across the last 30 to 40 years. And that's what this is. This is a trend analysis that goes back to the 1980s in some of these locations. And a watershed as big as the state of Florida. Now, how do we compare Florida to that? We don't have one water body into which everything drains. You can drain into the Indian River Lagoon, then the Atlantic, the Biscayne Bay, Naples Bay, Sarasota Bay, Tampa Bay, Pensacola Bay. So we don't have one location, but what we do have is a report that summarizes what we're finding on a statewide water quality trend analysis. And it's the same thing. It's flow adjusted because wet weather and dry weather give different influences to nutrient concentrations. So you want to correct for that, excuse me. So this is 78 sites, last 20 years, and this is the trend analysis that came out from DEP 2024. So I've highlighted in red the most common finding of these different trend analyses. It's in one of their tables there. TP stands for total phosphorus. And what you can see is that no trend. So there's a lot of variability, but there's no trend is the most common finding. But improving would mean decreased phosphorus. We don't want that many more nutrients. Only about 4% of sites is the phosphorus going up. So in general, in Florida, we're doing a pretty good job with phosphorus control, which is good news. But we've known this for 20 years. Some of the researchers at University of Florida, you know, Dan Canfield and Mark Hoyer had pointed this out 20 years ago. But look at total nitrogen. The most common trend is an increase. Degrading nitrogen means an increase. So we're seeing more places, not a whole lot more, but more places where the nitrogen is going up than it's going down. So 32% show a decrease in nitrogen. Chesapeake Bay is over 90%. So it's a big difference in the outcome for nutrients. Chlorophyll A is a pigment that's found in every photosynthetic organism, whether you're a floating microscopic phytoplankton or a sequoia tree, you have chlorophyll A. And it's used as an indicator of how much algae you have. And oh, hey, Vincent, there's like a couple people in the waiting room, I think. Sorry, it just popped up on
Okay.
my screen.
Oh, great. Thank you. I will take care of that.
So if you look at chlorophyll A, when there is a trend, you're three times as likely that chlorophyll is going up than chlorophyll is going down. So what we're seeing is it's not really moving in the right direction we'd hope it to be at. And then one of the other things that's really important is look at the water temperature trend. So none of the sites that have been visited show decreasing water temperatures. About half of them, a little bit less, show no trend. A lot of variability, but no trend. Half of them show the water getting warmer. So that's in a nutshell what we're showing for the state of Florida from our long-term monitoring program. The water's getting warmer more often than it's staying stable, and it's certainly not getting colder. Um, the amount of phosphorus has been going down. My nitrogen is more likely to be going up than going down, but the amount of algae is increasing at a rate of three times the places where the amount of algae is decreasing. So we're really not seeing that kind of good news story across Florida. And one of the other things, look at the disparity between phosphorus trend getting lower and chlorophyll going higher. Most TMDLs for inland water bodies are based upon phosphorus, but we've known for 20 years that it's just not that simple. Things that influence water quality in most of our lakes are beyond simply how much phosphorus is in a water column. Things like the war on hydrilla or hydrologic modification might have more to do with describing what's wrong with our freshwater water bodies than some of the other things that we're seeing, such as nutrient supply. So the reason why they wanted to do a nutrient budget in Chesapeake Bay was a lot of different reasons. But one of the main ones was they wanted to get their seagrass back because seagrass is an important feature. They don't have manatees. I think they've had like one manatee on occasion up there. But like, for example, blue crabs, which is a big cultural and economic part of the Chesapeake Bay like lifestyle, need seagrass meadows. So this is a plot of the last 20 years of seagrass coverage in the Chesapeake Bay. Again, 10 times as big as Tampa Bay. The red line is the latest value. And what you can see is this is a resilient system. That's what this is showing. So nature isn't supposed to function like a Sherman tank, that like you can hit it with a bazooka and nothing happens. It's supposed to be resilient. You can take a big rainfall event and you're going to have a reduction, but it can bounce back. And what we see here is over the last 20 years that are on this, we see this pattern of reductions associated with really high rainfall events. So we had a big, huge rainfall event in 2018, and we saw a reduction, but then within 2 years, it starts to increase again. And that is it's the fourth time this has happened in that system. This is what resilience is. Resilience is a system that can take a hit and it doesn't collapse like the Indian River Lagoon did, particularly in the central portions of the Indian River Lagoon. And if you look at the yellow line, that's a 1984 estimate. So there's more than twice as much seagrass in the Chesapeake Bay than there was 40 years ago. What about Florida? Do we have twice as much seagrass? Not at all. We've lost about 150 square miles of seagrass in the last 20 years in the state of Florida. You know this very well in the Indian River Lagoon, but it's not just the Indian River Lagoon. It's also Biscayne Bay. It's also Naples Bay. It is now less seagrass in Charlotte Harbor than any time in the last 30 years. Old Tampa Bay now has less seagrass in the last 30 years. Pensacola Bay, let's see, Santa Rosa Sound, Big Lagoon, it's over and over again. So we're not having the success story of Chesapeake Bay. And I don't mean to suggest Chesapeake is pristine, but it's moving in the right direction. So in Sarasota Bay, we kind of charted our own course because we wanted to look around and find success stories and follow what they've done. So that's what we did. We talk about water chemistry, we talk about price, but the first thing we do when we talk to the public is we talk about quality of life because this is what people like to do on a summer weekend in Sarasota Bay. They like to go out there, throw out their anchor, stand around in waist deep water, look down and see their feet. And they don't want to have rafts of macroalgae wrap around themselves, their kids, or their grandkids. And that's what I do. That's what I've been doing with my family for like 30 years. And so this is a quality of life issue for us, but it's also an economic issue. There's not a lot of commercial fishing villages in the state of Florida, but we have a thriving one in Sarasota Bay. It's called Cortez. And it's thriving because our waters are healthier now than they were 10, 15 years ago. And also, they're very smart about like, they actually are selling their catch right there at waterfront restaurants. There are like 5 waterfront restaurants. So rather than losing out on the uplift of when you sell your fish to like New York, sell it right there and you make more money. Uh, but we also have 20,000 jobs that are associated with water-related activities, commercial fishermen, recreational fishing guys, the waiters and waitresses and bartenders and the owners of restaurants. And so that's a big part of the reason why we can make this economic argument. And then on the right-hand side, this is what it looks like when we have a big red tide outbreak. And imagine you've like driven down with your family, the kids, oh boy, that'll be fun, from Ohio for a beach vacation, and you see this sign. Or like you've just flown in from like London with your kids and you see the sign. You're not going to want to come back again. And in 2018, when we had a wicked strong red tide, it absolutely was devastating for our businesses. The economic impact was more than $2 billion, excuse me, around $2 billion from that red tide. It affects property values. So that's our economic argument. And then we want to make sure when we start talking about the environment, people understand what we're talking about. So seagrass meadows are not to be confused with dune grass or like sea oats or marsh grass. A lot of people aren't from here. So here's a seagrass meadow, and it shows an underwater photo so you can understand, oh, it's a plant. It needs sunlight. The clarity of the water will thus be important in how much light can penetrate. So the link between water clarity and seagrasses can be made with this photo, we think. And also the habitat value. Look at the school of bayfish that's found at that ecotone between the seagrass meadows and mangrove fringe. All right. Then we want to pull it, we want to tug at their heartstrings a little bit. So we show this photo. And there's plenty of gruesome photos about what it looks like, for starving manatees. But we don't want to do that anymore. We want to do this picture. This is the cutest thing in the world. Who wouldn't want to have a job staying in a pool, bottle feeding a baby manatee? But, why are they being bottle fed? They're being bottle fed because their moms starved to death. And their moms starved to death because there was not enough seagrass because of degraded water quality. The epicenter of the last 5, 6 years of seagrass die-off and manatee die-off has been the Indian River Lagoon. It's your backyard. And we have lost over 3,000 manatees in the last 5 to 6 years. The last time we had a statewide estimate, it was 8 to 11,000. That's the range. So literally, since most of that die-off has occurred on the East Coast of Florida might have lost more than half of its manatees in the last couple of years. It's driven by this unusual mortality event, which we now have determined is over. But the reason why it's over is because you can only die once. We don't have as many manatees dying because they've already died. And also, look at those young manatees. Manatees are a matriarchal society. They're related to elephants, and they have the same kind of female-led society. So you release those manatees back into the wild, they won't know what to do. They won't know how to be a manatee. They won't know where to go when the water temperature gets cold. They won't know how to behave. So this is a real problem. We have our manatee population because the first year, 2021, where it was particularly virulent, that hit that we had, it was females that got hit more than anything else, and mothers who gave up the last bit of their energy for their offspring. So the Indian River Lagoon is the epicenter of what's happened, but it's not the only place. All these other locations, Biscayne Bay and Charlotte Harbor and Pensacola Bay, documentation 150 square miles of seagrass we've lost over the last 20 years. Chesapeake Bay has gained twice as much seagrass. So we're on the different trajectory as Chesapeake Bay. So in Sarasota, what we wanted to do is we wanted to chart our own pathway. And I took the job basically saying, I'm going to do this for 5 years because I think we can turn it around in 5 years. And so that's what we did. So managing Sarasota Bay means managing nitrogen. Same thing, turning the water green, if you would. But it's more than just the water column. So this graphic is from the Chesapeake Bay region, the University of Maryland, and it kind of shows the totality of things that go wrong as you increase nutrient loads. And it shows more epiphytic algae, which is the algae growing on the seagrass, more macroalgae. And yes, the water gets greener. But the only thing you have to measure to come up with how healthy is my system, Sarasota Bay, Indian River Lagoon, is the water column, the water chemistry, the phytoplankton levels. That's it. And so we knew that that wasn't holistic enough. So we came up with a report card that includes everything here but the fish. We're working on trying to, or the new director is working on trying to get the fish involved in here. But everything in this graphic is part of our report card. So our report card went through this kind of fairly rigorous technical review. And what we found is we had like nitrogen concentrations, chlorophyll, how green the water is, but also seagrass and also macroalgae. So the math behind it, if you want to talk about that, it's fine. You know, I can give you a heads up on it. But what we also want to do is we didn't want to preach to the choir. We wanted to expand the congregation. We wanted more people to understand what we're talking about when we talk about the health. If the only people who can understand the system is like chemists and statisticians, then you're not being successful because they don't control budgets. So we color coded our results. Blues and greens represent healthy conditions. Yellow is caution. Red is like stop what you're doing, something's going wrong. And this color coding process worked really well for talking to the public and elected officials. So we have 5 base segments. We don't compare them against each other because they would have been different 100 years ago because of different ratios between the watershed and the open water. So instead, we compare them against what they were like when they were healthier. So we can't go back farther than the best data, and we have to have data on all 4 of those parameters. So we can only go back to 2006, but that actually turns out to be just fine because here's our report card. And actually, I apologize. We actually have 2025 now as well, or the estuary program. I'm no longer the estuary program. So we have data that goes to 2025, but you have 3 different time periods here. The reference period, we had a 30% increase in seagrass coverage across the bay. Apologize, it's about 28%, but about 30%. That doesn't happen in an unhealthy system. You don't gain 30% seagrass increase in an urban estuary unless your water quality is doing pretty good. And it was. Lower nitrogen, lower chlorophyll, where we had data, less macroalgae. But the next 7 years, we call the degraded period. And during that time period, we lost 30% of our seagrass in the lower bay, and then we lost about 20% in the upper bay, different timelines, but generally during that time period. So we had yellows, and we had greens, and but mostly we had yellows, and we had reds. It's the only time we had reds, which is like really poor conditions that we had in 2 parts of the lower bay. But look at the last couple of years, and it's actually improving, despite the fact that we had Piney Point, which is that fertilizer spill. I don't know if you heard about that over on the East Coast, but it was a nightmare over here. We had Hurricane Ian in 2022, Tropical Storm Nicole. 2024, we had 4 events. We had the highest hourly rainfall on record, and then we had Tropical Storm Debbie, which gave us about 15 inches of rain. Then we had Helene, which gave us 7 feet of storm surge. Then we had a Category 3 hurricane hit our coast in Sarasota, which was Milton. It was really hard to like live through that, but despite all that, we still stayed a healthier system than we were a couple of years ago. What do you think Indian River Lagoon would be like if it had 4 tropical events hit them in 1 year? Do you think they would be as resilient as this? I don't think so. So we wanted to do that. So how did we get improving from that degraded condition? Was we understood how we got degraded in the first place. So we had a loading model that is based on dissolved inorganic nitrogen. That's different than any other system in the state of Florida that is being managed. It's not that different than how we're managing Long Island Sound and other locations, but in the state of Florida, if you do a TMDL, if you do a pollutant load reduction goal, the guidance is all forms of nitrogen are equally damaging, and that's just not true. So we focused on inorganic nitrogen loads, and we found that inorganic nitrogen loads were about 20% higher comparing those two systems. That was our load reduction goal, and we got there in a year. So 20% is the difference between those two time periods on the inorganic nitrogen load. So that's 12 tons. So that same year, in 2021, we said, let's have a workshop. Bring us your projects. How do we get a 12-ton load reduction? And our model says there's two things we can act upon that can way more than get our 12-ton reduction. And that is reclaimed water is number one thing. There's a lot of effort in the state of Florida to take septic tanks and take them to sewer, which makes a lot of sense sometimes, maybe most times, but not all the time. And we actually are loading 100 tons of nitrogen onto our landscape in reclaimed water. And if it's a pretty low concentration, it's not a big deal. But we have a location half an hour from where I live that was adding 70 inches of reclaimed water at 18 milligrams per liter. That is way more nitrogen than any landscape can take. So we're creating a plume of nitrate through underground that comes into our water systems. That's been shown in Brevard County and in Sanibel that sometimes you can make it worse by taking septic tanks offline, taking it to a wastewater treatment plant, not reducing the nutrients as much as you can, and then over applying it in waterfront communities. So we believe that 80% of our reclaimed water doesn't make it to the bay, but even if just 20% does, that's 20 tons. Wastewater spills and overflows, 15 tons per year. That's based upon, over that 7-year period, we had 1 billion gallons of wastewater come into our bay out of compliance with our permits with high nutrient concentrations. And 1 billion gallons sounds like a huge volume of water, and it is, but it's about 3% of the volume of wastewater. So our wastewater utilities were doing a great job with 95, 97%, but that 3% or so was enough to really trip us into a lot of those problems. So in 2023, we found that according to our model and the actions that have been implemented, and we'll talk about them in a moment, we had met our pollutant load reduction goal when we did that in 3 years. So this is the evidence for the load reductions based upon our model. So this is inorganic nitrogen loads into the lower bay, which is mostly from those illicit discharges that occurred. And the worst year we had was 2018, which was the worst year we've ever had for red tide in our system. So the worst year for red tide was also the worst year in terms of nutrient levels. Remember, humans don't cause red tides, but we can cause them to be worse. That's what we think happened. But getting our wastewater wet weather storage capacity under control and reducing the nutrient concentrations, we believe brought us about an 8-ton per year decline from 2018 to 2022. It happened very quickly. In the upper bay, we didn't really have those illicit overflows. We just had the over application of nutrient-rich reclaimed water. And we think that we about doubled the load. And the response was Manatee County worked to reduce the nutrient concentrations in their effluent from 13 to 7 milligrams per liter. If you keep your nutrient concentration below 10 milligrams per liter, and you don't add more than 30 inches, according to UF work that we've seen, that should be sufficient for St. Augustine to handle, for example. But if you're adding 70 inches at 18 milligrams per liter, you're just kind of like you're hiding the nutrient load, but you're not getting rid of it. Now, we also had a big stormwater retrofit project because one of the things that we're seeing is this was a city-owned, City of Sarasota owned a golf course that just wasn't getting the amount of business, the amount of people coming that it used to. And so we took half of that golf course, a project between Water Management District and City of Sarasota, and turned it into regional stormwater retrofit project. And it treats 5,800 acres of watershed that had no stormwater rules. And one of the things we see in Florida is people would like to blame like the newcomers for all the water quality problems when actually new development with stormwater treatment systems and maybe hooked up to a better wastewater treatment plant might not be as damaging as older development, particularly in terms of stormwater. So that got us about 900 pounds. Big project, good project, had flood attenuation issues as well, but it didn't give us the big bang for the buck that we got with the wastewater. So how did our bays water quality respond? This is the data set the DEP looked at, and it kind of shows about a more than 50% decline from our worst case scenario to what we saw in 2022. And I know some people might say, well, that's probably driven by a drought, right? 2022 was the year we had Hurricane Ian drop 15 inches of rain. This is not by a drought. This is a continued pattern. Even though we had all that big rain in 2024, we're still not seeing levels as high as they used to be. So this is a big improvement in water quality. And the improvement was big enough that every part of open waters of Sarasota Bay are on the D list. So our water quality improved sufficient that we're no longer impaired for nutrients. So we're the only urban estuary in Florida, and we have a higher population density, people per square mile, than Biscayne Bay. We're 3 times as many people per square mile as Tampa Bay, and yet none of our open waters are impaired for nutrients, something we're very proud of. And what did that bring about? The thing we were hoping for is a seagrass increase, and that's what we saw. This is from 2022 to 2024. That's almost a 2,000 acre increase. It's a 19% increase. It's the second biggest increase in 30 years, and it reverses a trend of downward patterns, down or flat, that we've seen for more than a decade. So this is the good news that we actually were hoping would happen, and it did happen. So we made sure that the policymakers, the elected officials who okayed the budgets for these huge infrastructure investments, we'll talk about the price tag in a moment, got the credit they deserved for making this. So we spent a lot of time taking reporters out into the field, and this is what it looks like underwater in Sarasota Bay. Not bad. Picture on the left shows one of our colleagues swimming around a bare area surrounded by seagrass, kind of like that darker signature as a seagrass. And that's in 6 to 7 feet of water. And as you can see, since it's like at an angle, you can see more than 10 feet across that system. That's what our water clarity is like. Secudiscs go to the bottom and you can see them clearly on the bottom. And all that dark signature around that person in that area, none of that existed a few years ago, but it came back and we planted none of it. We had no seagrass transplanting in Sarasota Bay. That came back from natural recruitment as the water quality got better, as we got our pollutant loads under control. Not saying there's no room for seagrass transplanting in some areas, but we didn't need it, we didn't use it. In the middle is our colleagues holding 3 juvenile gag grouper. So if you like to catch grouper, they're found offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, but in their early life history stages, they're in places like the recovering seagrass meadows of Sarasota Bay. And on the right-hand side, it's a picture I took of 2 manatees in Little Sarasota Bay. We don't have starving manatees in Sarasota Bay. We don't want them. And in fact, those are nice big fat manatees. But it also shows that the human influence has not disappeared with improving water quality, because look at the big prop scar behind mom's head. But nonetheless, she survived it and she gave rise to that big fat calf that we see, that we're very happy to see. So this is why our system got better. We spent, in 5 to 7 years, we spent $300 million. And money is a really important part of returning a system to a healthy condition. So not the only success story. We had a bunch of them. Some of them slipped up a bit lately. But this is a paper I wrote, and this is seagrass trends from 1999 to 2016. 2018 paper had to go to 2016. And that black line on the top refers to the totality of Tampa Bay, Sarasota, 11 Bay, and Charlotte Harbor. And that increase that we see there is 30,000 acres. It's 2 Manhattans, 40 square miles. That huge increase was not brought about by transplanting our way. It was brought about by reducing our pollutant loads, getting our water quality under control, and the seagrass came back on its own. And we have seen some backsliding, if you would, in Old Tampa Bay, Charlotte Harbor, but Sarasota Bay also had that, but we turned it around. So we've had these setbacks, but what we did in the past, I don't see there's any reason why we can't do it in the future. All right, other issues, other locations. This is Galveston Bay. This is a nitrogen limited system that had a problem with oxygen, so hypoxia. And the graphic on the left shows the nitrogen values compared against the criteria that they developed. And they're looking pretty good. And in fact, they seem to be good enough to actually have allowed for oxygen to be healthy enough to protect fish and crabs and shrimp that are found. Not everywhere, not in the Houston Ship Channel, for example. But this is a system that's surrounded by the city of Houston, which is the 4th biggest city in the United States. And despite that, it doesn't have the oxygen problems it used to have. So that's a good success story. Here's another one, Narragansett Bay up in New England. It urbanized 100 years before Houston, and it had problems with oxygen. But if you see the trend in black, which is the reduction in nitrogen over time into Narragansett Bay, that's kind of mirrored by the green line, which is the reduction in chlorophyll, the reduction in the amount of algae. And that is giving a benefit in terms of hypoxia. So they have this thing called a hypoxia index. And the hypoxia index, we used to have some periods of time where it was lower, and that was good, but we had high values that were really problematic. And we don't have those high values anymore for the last, say, decade or so. So we're seeing reduction in hypoxia driven by a reduction in phytoplankton, driven by a reduction in nutrients. The same sort of thing is happening on a much larger scale in Long Island Sound, which is a huge system. The graphic on the left shows the nutrient loads coming into Long Island Sound from wastewater treatment plants in Connecticut and New York. Connecticut had more to do because Connecticut is the majority of the watershed coming into Long Island Sound. But they met their goal back in 2017. So on the left is wastewater alone. On the right is the totality of loads flow normalized. And so that red line coming down from the peak values that we had in the mid 1980s means we've reduced the nutrient loads into Long Island Sound. Why did we do that? Because we wanted to get hypoxia under control. And that's what's happened. We used to have an average of 200 square miles of Long Island, particularly in the western side, didn't have enough oxygen for fish and crabs and shrimp, just a real nuisance. And now we actually had values of 400 square miles in some years, I think 94 or something like that. But now it's trended down to less than 100. And actually, the last year that I've got, and I don't have that number with me, but 2024 was, I believe, around 50 square miles. So a big, huge reduction. Hasn't solved the problem completely, but Long Island Sound is now healthier than it's been in decades. Same neighborhood, New York, New Jersey Harbor. This shows nitrogen concentrations in some of the major tributaries and some of the major water bodies in New York, New Jersey Harbor. And these numbers are like 2.5 to 3.5% decline per year for nitrogen. So over a 20-year period, this is about a 60% reduction in nitrogen concentrations in places like Newark Bay and Jamaica Bay and the Harlem River. And why did they do that? They wanted to reduce the oxygen problem. On the left-hand side, we see in the blue lines the percentage of samples that exceeded that had oxygen levels lower than 4.8. If you're lower than 4.8 for a long period of time, you're going to have a problem with fish and crabs and shrimp and all that. And it used to be 80% of the values in the 1950s were less than 4.8, and now it's less than 20%. Acute hypoxia is a value that's so low, if you hit it for just like maybe a couple of hours, it's enough to kill fish. And that used to be 20% of our values, 20 to 30% 70 years ago. And now it's down to mostly zero for most of the time in the last couple of decades. And the graphic on the right is PCB levels in fish, including things like striped bass. If you've ever seen that Anthony Bourdain does Brooklyn, he went offshore at the tail end and went with some buddies. They went fishing off of Rockaway Beach, and they caught a beautiful striped bass and cooked it up. Now, 50 years ago, that would have been a great way to poison yourself with PCBs, but not anymore. It's a cleaner, healthier system. And what does that give? Gives wildlife a chance to come back. Bald eagle nests. There were zero bald eagles in the New York, New Jersey area, and now we've got close to 100. Peregrine falcons are found in increased numbers. In fact, I've been in the New Jersey Meadowlands one time in my whole life on a field trip up there. And we looked off to the right, to the east, and saw like the, Billionaires Row of Midtown Manhattan and a bald eagle flying around. The only time I've ever been in the New Jersey Meadowlands, I saw a bald eagle because they can make it in this healthier environment. And the best sign, you want to talk about charismatic megafauna? This is the tail fluke of humpback whale close to Manhattan's Upper East Side. So this is in the East River, which means it swam under the Brooklyn Bridge. And in fact, you can see videos. They're kind of grainy, but there are videos, and they're not AI generated. It's actually videos of well-respected organizations of humpback whales swimming in the East River because that water is cleaner now than it's been in maybe 100 years. And that's one of the cool things. There are large-scale ecosystem recovery stories out there. Lake Erie is now cleaner than it's been in decades. Chicago River, not all of it, but there's a place called the Natural Mile where you can swim in the Chicago River. The Thames Estuary is cleaner than it's been in centuries, they believe. Copenhagen, downtown Copenhagen, has an underwater sculpture garden. The Seine River is now clean enough you can swim in it in the summertime. and not right after a rain event, obviously. So all these good stories, but you can't do it with good science without good science. But you can't do it with good science alone, because what we seem to be caught up in over and over again is this paralysis by analysis approach. We can't move forward unless we have perfect knowledge. You'll never have perfect knowledge. We need to be biased towards action. And the other part, I think, is we need to be careful about our projects. We've been doing ecosystem restoration work on water quality for decades now. So what works and what doesn't work is pretty evident by now. And we do a lot of things that don't have a track record of success. So um, you can't do this on the cheap either. So the way I look at it is if there's something wrong with your car, if it's making a weird noise, it's vibrating, or it's pulling to the left or the pulling to the right, you go to the mechanic and you say, what's wrong with my car? What do we need to fix it? And what is it going to cost? And we don't do that in Florida. We basically we just, we're thrilled with whatever money we get. And so let's say Indian River Lagoon gets $500 million, which I think is a realistic number. That's a huge amount of money, and you should be very grateful for it. But it's also 90% less money than what you need. There's a price tag for fixing Inner Lagoon's problems. It's been out there for years. It's $5 billion. We've spent $1 billion in Sarasota Bay. You've got a price tag in the East Coast and Inner Lagoon of $5 billion. And if you only spend 500 million, you're not doing enough. Is it worth spending 500 million if no one can tell the difference, except for like a modeler and a statistician? So I think we need to have the same approach. We need to have that open line of communication with the people that control budgets. And I think we also have these future challenges. Population growth is real. It's going to happen. It's happening in most places in the country. But it doesn't mean more pollution because there's more people in New York City than there were 100 years ago, but it's cleaner water. There's more people in Tampa Bay than there were 40 years ago, but it's cleaner water. So it depends on what you do with things like wastewater and stormwater. And our infrastructure for wastewater and stormwater is aging and it is at risk because of climate change. Climate change is real. 90% of Floridians believe in it. 70% of Floridians believe humans are playing some role in it. Those are both correct. And what we're seeing in Florida is our rainfall is becoming less predictable. We're getting more droughts, but we're also getting more intense rain events. It's not like the rain is changing on an annual basis, but the frequency of like 5 inches per day or something like that is increasing. And when you combine that with sea level rise increasing, then you have this scenario on the right-hand side, which is what happens when we have more rainfall and the outlet of our storm drains are now completely submerged? Because we believe by the year 2040 or so, half of the stormwater pipes in Sarasota Bay will be submerged in high tides. And when that happens with more intense rain, that's when I think people are going to start to take this stuff seriously. Elevated sea level rise at rates higher than anything we've seen for the last 5,000 years. And with that, that's all I got. I thank you for your time.
Cool. Thank you, Dave. That was fantastic. So I'm going to get into some of the questions we have in the chat. If you have anything to enter that in really quick. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to launch a poll. And if you could please fill that out. And let me get that out of the way here. And I will start with some of the questions. I did have
Oh,
a
let me say
couple.
hi to Bob Bernstein first off. Then I
Oh
saw
yeah,
him.
hey
Yeah.
Bob. You can unmute yourself. Oh, you're still muted.
Write on paper and show it to me, Bob.
Yeah, you're still muted, Bob.
Sorry, dude. Can't hear you. He can give me a call. He knows my phone number.
Okay. Bob, if you would like to enter a question in the chat, feel free to do so. So I'm gonna start. I had a couple questions, but I'm gonna start with other people first. Um, Liz asked, and I think this is really for all of us that are here. Are there any group or citizen science project that is doing bioregional mapping of watersheds in Florida to collect different layers of data? If yes, she does ask if you can reach out to her, and she's got her email in the chat there.
Okay.
Is that is there anything that you're aware of, Dave? Like,
Well,
That
like Florida's watersheds are pretty well defined by the USGS. And then, well, a typical approach for figuring out, how to fix your water quality problems is you'll do a modeling approach where you take like, here's my watershed, and then here's, how much it rains, and here's the runoff, and here's the nutrient concentration runoff, and that figures that comes in there. But that's kind of pretty well known. I think one of the problems we have with loading models like that is that it assumes all nutrient loads are the same. So atmospheric deposition is a big part of a lot of people's nutrient budgets. But work we did in Sarasota Bay found we couldn't make algae grow faster with atmospheric deposition. So we just don't count it the same.
Mhm.
So be careful with your nutrient budgets. If a pound of nitrogen from wastewater is given the exact same weight as a pound from stormwater and a pound from atmospheric deposition, then I think what you do is you underappreciate how important wastewater was.
Yeah. Right. Cool. Thanks. Question from Jason. List nutrients, dissolve oxygen, salinity, but what toxins should we also be measuring?
Yeah, that's a great point. It kind of depends, what kind of watershed you have. So if you have a watershed that has a lot of, industrial activity, and Florida doesn't have a whole lot of industrial activity, but we do have some. We've had parts of Sarasota that have been contaminated with lead and zinc and mercury. We've had mercury problems in portions where we had like this high tech kind of like um, sort of like this high tech. It's like Mark Marietta did something for like in the Cold War. I don't know what it was exactly, but you certainly can have different metals, for example, but also things like PCBs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Think about your tires. When your tires wear down, where does that go? Well, that kind of that rubber and the rubber additions go into storm drain, and when your brakes wear down. Where does that go? That goes into storm drains as well. So you don't have
Mhm.
to have industry to have pollutants like toxins, and toxins can be really important. So look at that trend that we had for PCBs in New York City's waters. You could have had water quality that was good. You could have had plenty of like oxygen in water, but if you had PCB levels that high, then your humpback whales would have a hard time staying healthy eating Atlantic menhaden.
Cool. Thank you. Let me see if I've got this. The next one here from Katie. What role slash impact would you say bivalve restoration has played in some of those case studies? Specifically looking at New York Harbor, the Chesapeake Bay, and
Yeah.
areas in New England.
So I think that the way I would look at it is they're never a bad idea. But if they are the only thing you do, then it's not going to be enough. So New York City Harbor, for example, has the Billion Oyster Project. If you've never read the book, New York used to be called not the Big Apple, but the Big Oyster. It led oyster consumption in the United States from New York's waterways. It was unbelievably important, and it was a big part of the economy. So they're actually trying to put a billion oysters into New York City's waters. But the only reason they can do that is because we've acted on the pollutant loads. So it's kind of like clams and seagrass and all that. It's never a bad idea. But like if you haven't gotten rid of the human reason why they were lost in the first place, why do you think it'll be successful? And how would it live now? It's kind of like you don't give, yeah, there you go, Big Oyster. It's a great book. Uh, and you don't want to give like a liver transplant to an active alcoholic. So why in the world would you basically just put seagrass into an area where you haven't fixed the underlying water quality problem? So I think there's reasons for it. I think there's value to it. But when we gained that 30,000 acres in Tampa Bay down to Charlotte Harbor, 99, 2016. We didn't plant any of it. And that recent 2,000 acres in Sarasota Bay, we didn't plant any of it. There's reasons why it makes sense in some locations, but I feel like Tallahassee just goes off on these weird little tangents like, oh, seagrass is important. Here you go. Here's $20 million to plant seagrass across the state of Florida. That's just not what we need. We need a lot more money to fix the underlying problems. And I think it's just pennies on the dollar.
Right. Thanks. So Bob's got a comment in here. Says yes,
All
the
right, time's
Indian
up.
it says, yes, the Indian River Lagoon has been the bad boy example, but a recent St. Johns River Water Management District report shows an increase in seagrass from 2023 to 2025 of 70%, but still only slightly 50% above maximum And Bob's comment also, I had a question earlier that I think is related to that. That, and I mentioned that recent regain of seagrass that's been reported. It, are those regains, just like those decreases were kind of statewide? Are the regains also statewide? And what can we attribute to
And one of the
those?
things
Yeah.
too, and then Bob can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of this is driven by the Mosquito Lagoon, where there's certainly not the thumbs up or thumbs down on that, Bob. So I think it's mostly Mosquito Lagoon. And Mosquito Lagoon doesn't have nearly the population density as, the upper Indian River Lagoon. And the big increase you can have, I mean, the biggest increase I'm familiar with is in Hillsborough Bay, where they went up more than 100%, more than double. But that's because the denominator got so small. So,
Hmm.
you can have a big percent increase, but it's a percent increase that looks really impressive because you were down so low. So it's kind of like,
Right.
have you gotten back to where you are? We're not back to where we were back in 26 to 2012, but we're moving in the right direction. And we're about 20% lower than that. But, I think all those things, you don't want to like poo-poo like the good results of like losing it. But you didn't, for the most part, my understanding, your big increase was in the Mosquito Lagoon. Mosquito
Yeah.
Lagoon doesn't have a whole lot of people around it.
Yep. Yep.
I think that was recovery from a natural stressor more so than the underlying eutrophication problems in most of the system.
Cool. Um, yeah, and that's probably that the Mosquito Lagoon is included is part of the St. John River Water Management District area
Absolutely.
of study.
Yeah.
Yep, yep. Although they do monitoring down our way too in the Southern Lagoon as well.
Yeah, and that's good news. It is.
Yep.
But like, when the waters off of Palm Bay and Melbourne start getting that big increase, that's when I would be happy.
Cool. A question here from Missy. It's incredible to see these recoveries, but how do you maintain that momentum and sustain the need for continued financial support?
I think that's a great question because, when I first became the director in 2020, everyone was like really on board with doing everything that we needed to do because we were just, we had Piney Point disaster in April of 2021. We had the big red tide. We had the starving manatees in 2020. It was easy to say, dudes, this could be your future, or you could have a brighter future. It's up to you. But I think we're getting kind of complacent. And I do think that, like, reminding people of what it was like. So think about your worst year over there in the St. Lucie estuary and think about how, like, the guacamole looking algal blooms that you had, the cyanobacteria. Make sure people don't forget that because, like, if you're making progress, and I think Everglades restoration is one thing where Florida is doing a great job. We're putting huge amounts of money into it. And so we're doing great things that are going to reduce a lot of our problems. The concern I have is we're not doing that same level of effort across anything but the Everglades. We're just not.
Mm.
And so to me, you got to like let people know what's at risk, your quality of life, your economy. How would you like to sell? I had a couple of realtors on my policy board, and they told me it was almost impossible to sell a house during the 2017 to 2019 red tide. No one wanted to live on it. So if you wanted to buy a waterfront property, that was a great time to buy it because no one was actually getting their selling price because it just smelled bad. Nobody, if you were living in Sarasota Bay during 2017 to 2019 and after the hurricane in 2021, it was like go to some of our waterfront areas like St. Armand Circle, and it was like post 9/11. It was like there was no activity. No one was out there because it smelled bad. There were flies everywhere and dead wildlife just washing up on shore. So I'd say, like James Carville said, don't let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
Remind
Well,
people of
cool.
what it's at risk.
Yep. Yep. And you had I know we're getting close to the end here. I think we're basically at time, but just real quick, when you showed the cost and the investments, um, is there where are you for those investments, are you also did you also have the numbers that show the returns or is that something that needs to be worked out?
So we tried not to get too much into money because, like,
Yeah.
with a board that I had with, like, CPAs, when we start talking about the dollar value of seagrass meadow, they're like, what? And you start
Yeah.
talking about the nutrient. So what we did is we turned it into fish. We said
Yeah.
we gain enough seagrass to support 70 million fish. That's what we said. And that's what
Okay.
people actually understood and comprehend. So, 40,000 fish per acre is a good University of Florida, excuse me, FAU number and FWC number. So we said 2,000 acres of fish, we probably created habitat for more than 70 million fish, and that's all they needed. I mean, most of these are small fish, but small fish become big fish, and small fish are
Yep.
food for the big fish. So, but that's a good number, and that's all we did. We didn't get into that how much is an acre of seagrass worth because
Yeah.
then it just seems weird. And I don't think biologists are great, economists. So I'll just stick with the fish numbers.
Cool. I think that might be a good lesson to think about for the future and it's a good note to end on, I think. But yeah, Dave, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for coming. Um,
Thanks for
again,
hosting.
yeah, no, it's great to have you. And again, everybody, thanks for taking part in the poll as well. And keep in mind, our next webinar is June 16th. All right. And thanks again, Dave, and thanks everybody for coming. All right.
Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care. Bye bye.